The air was freezing. Unlike Los Angeles's usual warm days, the night had drained all the color from the city, leaving behind a dull gray cold. People hurried past each other, heads down, lost in their own worlds. But Keanu Reeves's eyes were always searching, always observing. As he approached an underpass, a small group of homeless people caught his attention. Seeing a few homeless individuals on the streets was nothing new, but something about this scene felt different. A small crowd had gathered around a man lying motionless on the ground. Even those who had grown accustomed to street life looked worried. Someone was trying to get him to drink water. Another draped an old, tattered jacket over him. Keanu stepped closer. The man lay still, barely breathing. As Keanu took another step forward, his eyes locked onto something that made him stop in his tracks. A faded military patch was stitched onto the man's torn jacket. This man had once served his country, and now he was being left to die. One of the homeless men noticed Keanu and slowly lifted his head. His face was lined with exhaustion and defeat. No one's helping him, not even the ambulance. They've left him here to die. Keanu's expression darkened. He knelt beside the man, observing him closely. His breathing was shallow. His lips were cracked. His hands, turning blue from the cold, barely twitched. He couldn't even open his eyes. "Who is he?" Keanu asked. The homeless man sighed. "His name is Thomas. Used to be a soldier, but every month it's the same story. Runs out of money, can't find food, but he's too proud to beg." Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. Sometimes a man's pride could be his greatest enemy. Thomas was starving. He hadn't eaten in 4 days. His body had given up on him. Keanu hesitated for only a second. If this man stayed here any longer, he wouldn't survive the night. There was no time to waste. He had to act. Keanu knelt down and carefully lifted Thomas. He was so weak that even the slightest movement made him shudder. The small crowd watched in stunned silence. One of them muttered, "You can't take him. Hospitals hate us. They'll just turn him away." Keanu's jaw clenched. His voice was firm, unwavering. "I don't think they'll turn me away." There was something in his tone, an unshakable certainty that made everyone pause. No one argued. Keanu wrapped an arm around Thomas's frail frame and helped him into his car. The drive was eerily quiet. Thomas was barely conscious. His labored breathing echoed inside the vehicle. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors acted immediately, but the news was grim. His body was shutting down from dehydration. He hadn't eaten in 4 days. His strength was critically low. Worst of all, he had lost the will to live. They hooked him up to IVs, trying to stabilize him. The battle wasn't just against his body's condition, it was against the emptiness in his soul. Time moved slowly in the hospital room. The silence bore witness to a lifetime of suffering. Keanu Reeves sat beside Thomas's bed. The man's breathing was uneven but stronger than before. His face was still pale, lips cracked and hands barely able to move. But the worst part was in his eyes. The eyes of a man teetering between life and death. Keanu waited. There was no rush, no pressure. He gave Thomas the space to speak when he was ready. Minutes passed. Finally, Thomas's eyelids fluttered open. At first, he stared blankly at the ceiling, as if struggling to remember where he was. Then, his gaze shifted. He saw Keanu, and his first words sent a jolt through Keanu's chest. "Why did you save me?" Keanu thought for a moment. There were many ways to answer that question, but the truth was simple. Because no one should die like that. Thomas closed his eyes again. It was clear that he wasn't used to hearing those words. The dim hospital light flickered against the ceiling. Keanu remained by his side. He knew this man had a story to tell, and Keanu was ready to listen. A heavy silence settled in the room. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath, and he began to speak. Once he had been a soldier. He had joined the army at a young age, learned how to survive, how to fight, how to stand on his own. He had seen things most people couldn't even imagine. He had lost friends, some to explosions, some to sniper fire, others to starvation and disease. But he had survived, and when he returned home, he thought he would be greeted with honor, with gratitude. That was what they had always told them. Your country will never forget you. But reality was different. When he came back, no one was waiting for him. One day, I was holding a rifle in the trenches. A few months later, I was washing dishes in a fast food restaurant. For a while, he tried to put his life back together, but war had carved deep wounds into his soul, wounds that weren't visible, but never stopped bleeding. The nightmares began. Every night he woke up in cold sweat, hearing echoes of gunfire, feeling the suffocating weight of the trenches, smelling the blood in the dirt. Then his family left. My wife, she didn't understand. Hell, I didn't understand myself. I had a son, but when I finally went to see him years later, he didn't even recognize me. I was just another forgotten man. Keanu Reeves lifted his head slightly. This wasn't just Thomas's story. It was the story of countless others, souls lost between the past and a future that never came. Keanu had met many people like Thomas, and they all shared one thing in common. War hadn't killed their bodies, it had killed their spirits. Thomas stared at the ceiling, his voice quieter now. You know, I didn't die in the war, but I died here. Keanu held his gaze. Thomas had been dead for a long time. Society had buried him long before his body gave out. When a person is ignored for so long, when they are cast aside, when there is no one left who remembers them, are they truly alive? Thomas wasn't living, he was just breathing. But Keanu couldn't accept that. This wasn't how the story would end. It was time for a change. And Keanu Reeves wouldn't let Thomas remain just another forgotten life. The next morning, Keanu Reeves returned to the underpass. This time, he wasn't alone. A delivery truck followed behind him, packed with 100 freshly prepared meals. As he stepped out, the homeless community stared in shock. No one expected this. Keanu moved without hesitation, opening the truck and pulling out boxes of food. He handed them out, plate by plate, not just offering meals, but sending a message. No one should die hungry. A hush fell over the crowd as they received warm food for the first time in weeks. Thomas, still recovering, accepted a plate with shaking hands. His eyes welled up with tears. Why are you doing this? Keanu simply smiled, his voice calm yet firm. Because I can. But this wasn't just about food. Keanu had something far greater in store for Thomas. That same day, Keanu started making calls. He reached out to veteran organizations, employment centers, and charities, searching for a way to help Thomas regain his dignity. And finally, he found it, a teaching position at a veteran rehabilitation center. When Keanu delivered the news, Thomas's face froze. His voice was barely a whisper. You found me a job? Keanu nodded. You were a soldier. You served your country. No one should forget that. Thomas looked at Keanu in disbelief. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, hope. But this was just the beginning. At first, Thomas doubted himself. Who would listen to him? What could he offer? For years, no one had trusted him. No one had asked for his advice. No one had needed him. But on his first day at the center, as he stood in front of a room full of struggling veterans, men just like him, he saw something in their eyes. They weren't just listening, they were seeing him. Thomas took a deep breath, and then, for the first time in years, he spoke with confidence. I thought my life was over, but now, I finally have a purpose. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And that day, not just Thomas, but countless lives changed forever. Keanu Reeves had once again proved a simple truth. One person can change the world. And now, the question is, if you were in Keanu's place, what would you do?